I'm David Wilson, Emeritus Professor of Criminology, and I've spent decades studying the phenomenon of murder and what might motivate someone to kill. My research suggests that whilst all murders are unique, they do indeed share some common deadly characteristics. Together, let's delve into some of the most chilling murder cases from across the UK and expose the reality behind this most terrible of crimes. This is Murder UK.
Suzanne was always very sporty. Always very sporty, very independent, always had lots of friends.
Suzanne had an absolute cracking job, something she really, really enjoyed. She passed an awful lot of exams at the firm that she was at.
She'd bought a house on her own, like a part-buy, part-rent house. She'd worked really hard.
She would just put herself out for anybody and always put other people in front of herself.
She was a really, really good mum as well. She absolutely adored Chloe. They were so close.
Chloe, now 18, is Suzanne's daughter. The pair share a special bond.
It was nice because it was the two of us, and next door she had like her best friend that she knew, and my best friend also lived next door, and it was nice.
We were such a close-knit family. We went on holiday together, you know, we did more everything together. Chloe was just our grandchild and we absolutely adored her.
Saturday night we'd push the sofas together in the living room and watch a film downstairs with the popcorn that we bought on the Friday night. That was like every week.
But there's one thing missing from Suzanne's life.
Both Laura and Claire had got into relationships and I think it's something that Suzanne wanted.
She didn't stay with Chloe's dad, it didn't work out.
She just wanted someone to love her. I think that's how Suzanne, wanted to feel loved.
In spring 2010, Suzanne got what she was looking for. They meet online. His name is John Wharton.
He was very athletic. He wasn't very tall, but he was very muscular.
He was a different character. He wasn't like the people that she used to date.
We were told by Suzanne that he was a trainer and he trained boxers.
The family is surprised by Suzanne's choice.
She asked if he could come to my wedding, which was in the August of 2010, which I said that was fine. I wasn't too happy about it because I didn't really know who he was.
He was quite eccentric. He was quite loud, over-friendly.
You know, when you just feel a bit like you want to step back a little bit, it was just a bit too much.
He just didn't seem to be the type that Suzanne would have gone for. But that was Suzanne's choice, and we obviously went along with it.
In love and in a hurry, the relationship becomes intense. Rushing into a relationship probably is, for most people, most of the time, a red flag. Now, quite clearly, I understand that sometimes you can fall head over heels in love. But often in this generation, that sense of how you're going to meet people online, you don't really know much about them. And therefore, you don't have that hinterland of who they are as a person that you can begin to judge whether this truly is the love of your life or going to lead to problems very, very quickly.
We did call her sweetie, and Valentine's Day used to go above and beyond. I think Suzanne just liked the whole of being loved and looked after and someone giving her attention.
I think we just started seeing him between the May-June 2010, and he quickly has moved in, living at Suzanne's.
I just remember him being there more and more.
She would go to my parents' house every day because my dad would take Chloe to school and pick her up, but that completely stopped. We would always go to my parents on a Sunday for Sunday dinner, but she quickly stopped coming.
She kind of just gently took herself out of the family unit.
But she just said, oh, you know, it's my little family now. I've got my own little family and we're doing things as a family together.
Suzanne grows distant from her family. On the rare occasions her family do see her, the changes in Suzanne are worrying. And quite clearly, because she's been kept away from her family, those changes become magnified when the family at last see her again.
She was quite timid, she wasn't as talkative when we saw her, and a bit more withdrawn.
She just didn't look herself, kind of let herself go.
Her appearance changed quite a bit.
Her hair was short. She just looked different. She looked tired.
I thought she'd lost quite a lot of weight.
Suzanne has lost weight at Wharton's insistence.
He actually made her a diet plan and a fitness plan because he said that she was overweight and chubby and all these things. So she stopped eating as much because of that. She was very self-conscious.
Wharton is clearly displaying coercive, controlling behaviour. Now, often that will begin very subtly to the extent that the victim doesn't recognise those coercive and controlling behaviours, but over time they gradually become more intense, but the victim will often choose to ignore them or forgive them. But what that does is almost permit the victim's personality to disappear, to become subsumed by the abuser's personality, so that the power dynamic within the relationship becomes all-encompassing and intense. And that's when that power dynamic means that the victim is in greatest danger.
Suzanne had informed us in the Christmas time that she'd lost her job and that they'd made redundancies.
We could never understand, you know, why she was made redundant because of the offences she had with the company.
Suzanne left because she couldn't go into work anymore. Obviously, he didn't want her to work.
He didn't like her mixing with other people.
It will have been very easy for John Wharton to persuade Suzanne and her daughter to have nothing to do with the outside world, with her family, with her workplace, because they will become brainwashed by this completely at war mentality that I think runs deeply within John Wharton.
You know, there was something that was niggling you, thinking this isn't right. There's something, you know, not right with him.
We were a little bit worried about the way that he acted, and yeah, he was a bit full on.
We didn't know anything about his family. We didn't know about if he'd got children. We didn't know any of that. We didn't even know his age.
There's something else they don't know. He isn't a boxing trainer. He's a cage fighter. And Suzanne will soon discover that his violence extends far beyond the ring.
Within 6 weeks of that relationship, she contacted a neighbour to say that she's had an argument with John Wharton.
Sue was crying. She said that John had kicked off, grabbed her by the throat, which you could see the marks around her throat, squeezed that hard that it felt like she couldn't breathe.
And her neighbour quite rightly said, you know, you need to leave this individual. But Suzanne appeared to make excuses for his behaviour, and she went home and back to that relationship.
I had to ask if I wanted to eat anything or get a drink and things like that. I'd overhear conversations like, she ate this and didn't ask and she left it out.
Everyone has a bad feeling about Wharton, but the reality is far worse than they imagine. One of the clear red flags in this particular story is that everybody has a bad feeling, but that bad feeling doesn't end the relationship. It merely makes the relationship more secretive. It makes the relationship much more intense between the two, and that's another way that Wharton can extend control over Suzanne.
We learned that John had got a history of domestic violence.
He had previous convictions for robbery, and this wasn't just going into a shop and wielding a knife. This was actually targeting vulnerable elderly pensioners.
We found out that he'd spent time in prison.
In fact, Wharton had spent nearly a decade behind bars for a succession of burglaries and violent robberies in 2000.
She knew nothing about his past, and that's concerning.
I think we're only beginning to scratch the surface about who John Wharton actually was, and whether or not the violence that we know that characterized his younger years actually defined his personality, or whether or not that violence was a way of him managing other things in his background.
It wasn't like a gradual thing where he just gets angry and angry. It was literally like 1 minute he'd be sat there on his phone and the next minute he'd be hitting you.
In fact, the convicted criminal's erratic behaviour belies another secret.
He'd actually been assessed for mental health, and on one occasion he'd actually been sectioned and diagnosed with schizophrenia.
I knew he was on medication because we went to town one time to pick up his medication, and he just said, he gave it to me, and he said, put that in that hole. There was a hole in the bricks when we walked past. He said, just put that in there. He chucked it out.
There are a number of people that are diagnosed with mental health issues, and the majority don't harm anyone. They're medically controlled, they take their medication, and they come to no harm to themselves or to other people. But in this particular case, you've got John Wharton, who had a previous history of violence towards vulnerable people. He's now been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He's been given medication for that. But we know on top of that, he's taken alcohol and recreational drugs. And that almost dilutes the impact of the medicine that he should be taking. And therefore, that makes him extremely unpredictable and high risk, in my view.
It's important to remember that Wharton had previously been sectioned under the provisions of the Mental Health Act, and he'd been diagnosed as a schizophrenic. Now, schizophrenia can be controlled if you take your medication to control your schizophrenia. The problem is when the person believes that they're misdiagnosed, that they're perfectly okay, that they stop taking their medication, that's when the problems begin. And those problems are going to become intensified if you are not only not taking your medication, but you're drinking alcohol to excess or you're using recreational drugs.
I remember seeing rolled up pieces of paper. When I was little, I didn't know what that is, but now I'd understand a bit more that that's a sign of him taking drugs.
What 7-year-old Chloe does understand is Wharton's violence.
You used to see him hit her all the time. Not all the time, but more than a child should see someone hitting their parent. I obviously used to see her having marks on her black eyes, bruises.
I think from an outsider looking in, everyone would say, just leave him, you need to get out of that relationship.
Suzanne will have bonded to him because they met online. If they'd met in real life before the bonding had occurred, she may have picked up on the cues that everybody else could see. But meeting online compounded the emotional need to find somebody that fills this need for attention that she had. Meeting online, it's purely a form of communication. It's not a human interaction. It's not a sharing of life that allows you to see the person in full. It's still about getting a message across when you meet online. It's about presenting a particular message, and it plays into the hands of somebody who is seeking to manage that message, somebody who has something to hide.
I used to live just round the corner from her. She'd often come round to my house and pop in. I'd phone her every day on the phone, but all of that just quickly stopped.
In 2012, the family's strained relationship with Wharton implodes when he visits Suzanne's mother, Anne.
He said, I want to marry Suzanne and I want to change my name to your name. And Anne said, well, I'm not really happy with that. And she said, you know, I don't really like the way you're treating Suzanne. And I don't think Les would like you to have his name. And from that point, he went ballistic.
This sense of being ready to battle, being on high alert, always ready to battle, is just beneath the surface. It doesn't take much to trigger it.
He shot out of the chair, started to go out, turned round, and he said, you'll never see your daughter or grandchild again.
This is all a build-up of control by Wharton to cut contact from friends and family and isolate Suzanne. Because she hasn't got that support network around her, she's very much alone. And that makes her extremely high risk. But there is someone who does know what's happening to Suzanne.
Within 6 weeks of that relationship, she contacted a neighbour to say that she's had an argument with John Wharton.
Sue was crying. She said that John had kicked off, grabbed her by the throat, which you could see the marks around her throat, squeezed that hard that it felt like she couldn't breathe.
And her neighbour, quite rightly, said, you know, you need to leave this individual. But Suzanne appeared to make excuses for his behaviour, and she went home and back to that relationship.
Suzanne's neighbours had a lot of correspondence with the police. I think it was approximately around 27 times they called out the police.
They approached the neighbours and said, look, we need you to be our eyes and ears because, you know, we can't be here all the time. And what we'd like you to do is keep a diary of any noises, any arguments, any strange behaviours that you see.
There was an instance where he'd beaten Suzanne up and she'd rushed out into the garden and was hiding under the trampoline. And the next door neighbour came out.
Suzanne's neighbour doesn't wish to be identified, but she reads from the journal she's kept.
I went into the back garden and heard Sue in her garden crying. I looked over the fence. Her face, nose, her eye and her cheek were swollen and starting to bruise. She had a cut on her foot that was bleeding. I asked if she was okay, if she wanted me to ring someone, family or the police. She said no, she needs to handle it.
She said to Suzanne, Suzanne, you've got to tell your mum and dad what's going on. You know, you can't keep going on like this. The response was, no, no, please don't ever tell mum and dad. Don't tell mum and dad. Promise me.
She told me that John had taken her away for a few days. He had beaten her quite bad, blacked both eyes. Her whole face was swollen. He'd kicked and punched her in the chest and broke a rib, pinned her to the floor and bit into her nose.
Yet Suzanne tells no one, and the abuse continues for her and her young daughter, Chloe.
There was a time that he said that I looked at him weirdly. So I wasn't allowed in the house because I looked at him a certain way. So he kicked us out. And I think we slept in a park for a night.
December 2011. I heard arguments in the street. Sue was running up and down the street screaming that John had taken Chloe after kicking her out of the house.
I don't think there was ever a moment where my mum ever relaxed because he could literally, for no reason, be horrible and hit her and kick her out.
We were worried about Chloe because, you know, Chloe was only about 7 years of age then.
I'd asked to put a safeguarding in for Chloe.
Social services arrange a visit.
He would say to you, don't say anything. He'd say, we're all happy. You're happy to be here. That's when you know. If someone tells you, you shouldn't say something. especially when he's that scary, you don't say anything.
Wharton is prepared. He even has an excuse ready to explain the bloodstains found inside the house.
So he'd moved the carpet rug, we had a black rug in the living room downstairs, he'd moved it into my room upstairs to cover it and to say, oh, when the door opens, like my mum tripped and that's why the blood's on the windowsill.
An increasingly difficult home life and now out of work, Suzanne is no longer meeting her mortgage payments and her home is repossessed.
Because I didn't live too far from Suzanne's, I would always drive past Suzanne's house and I'd be checking to see if her car was on the drive. And I'd noticed that the car wasn't there any longer and it hadn't been there for a couple of weeks.
Chloe was taken out of school and she never said a word.
We just left and that was it, we just went.
She lost her house and she moved in with him. So she lost everything.
The family sense Suzanne and Chloe are in real danger, so they decide to make their concerns official.
That evening, I went to police station with my parents and I reported Suzanne as missing.
We were there till probably 2 in the morning.
A police officer said to me that I needed to get my sister out of where she was. And I said to that police officer, I don't know where my sister is. I said, I can't get her out, where is she? And they said, I can't tell you where she is, but you need to get her out.
And I remember Laura saying to the police, if you don't do something about it, the next time we'll see Suzanne, she'll be dead.
Wharton moves Suzanne and Chloe to Frankley, a suburb on the Birmingham-Worcestershire border.
She is moving from her perfectly nice home with her daughter into his home, which is described as squalid.
She ended up living in a masonette flat, 1-bedroomed. Yeah, not very nice.
They'd sleep in the bed and sometimes there'd be either a bit on the floor where another bit where I would sleep, or sometimes me and my mum would just sleep in the bed and he would be wherever he would be.
Much later, Laura visits the flat. It's not what she expected.
There was just a mattress on the floor in one room, and then there was a living room with a sofa, with a broken window as well. The window was like all broken, hanging. When we walked in, pots and pans everywhere. It was just, yeah, not how Suzanne lived.
With Suzanne's family out of the picture, Wharton's control now becomes absolute. The front door is closed, the curtains are drawn. No one can look into the house and see how that relationship is developing.
Couldn't have contact with her anymore. I was blocked on her account on Facebook. I couldn't contact her via her phone anymore. I'm scared.
Suzanne Van Hagen is trapped in an abusive relationship. Her neighbour has made 27 calls to the police, 8 of them specifically about domestic abuse. Yet, John Wharton was never arrested for any of those incidents.
Suzanne suffered. She suffered those years that she was with him. She lost her house. She lost her personality. She was beaten black and blue.
All she wants is to help the man she loves.
She'd do anything to help anybody. And sometimes I always thought, you know, if people were taking advantage of her because of her nature.
Suzanne had a lovely, caring personality and she always saw the best in people.
She was the type of person who wanted to make things better, wanted to help people, believed in optimistic, upbeat. She wanted things to be okay, but she was fighting a losing battle with Wharton, who was, from the get-go, on this destructive life path.
Her life is ruled by fear. Chloe recalls a morning getting ready for school.
We went to get in the car, but the car had a flat tyre. She was like kind of panicking about the flat tyre. She was like, what should we do? She was like, just go in, go to sleep, nothing happened. You're not going to school today, and that was it. It was very frantic.
It's only a matter of time before Wharton sees the flat tyre.
And then as soon as he left, she looked out the window. I remember him coming back and like screaming about it, but that was it. I just remember him screaming, and she went out to talk to him, and it was just him screaming at her.
In 2012, Wharton tries to legally adopt Chloe. He's not successful, but insists that she calls him Daddy, another manifestation of the power that he has within that household.
He would be telling her, you know, it's just us, you know, no one wants to know us anymore. And he would say, you know, if you leave me, you know, Chloe's going to be fatherless again.
Every morning he would drive us to the train station, and then me and him would get on the train, go to school, and then we'd do that every morning.
He enrolls Suzanne on a vocational course.
I didn't know she was at college.
She ended up doing a beauty therapy course, I think.
He'd take her, pick her up, drop her off, but also meet her at lunchtime, and they would have to have their lunch together.
Anywhere she went, he knew about it. She had nothing of her own. She didn't have the opportunity to just leave. Like, she had her own car, that was her car. Then we got a new car, that wasn't her car anymore. So things slowly started getting taken away.
He kicked her out in the snow.
He would say, like, get out of my house. Like, he would be screaming at her, telling us to get out and that we're not welcome there, and it's not our house, it's his house and it's his rules.
Suzanne had to cover herself in plastic bags to keep warm.
I went to bed and then I couldn't sleep, so I'd ask my mum to come back and like help me go to sleep, and like she took me into bed and she said, you know, it's like fine, like I love you. And that's the last thing I remember. And then I remember her on the floor, just so the bed, and she was just like by the door. I remember him being on top of her and putting something in her mouth and strangling her. Because I said, why is she getting up? Like, what's wrong with that? And he was, oh, she's just sleeping. And he'd poured like water on her or something. And then I said, you need to call an ambulance.
Chloe follows Wharton into the living room. He appears to dial 999, but it's not a phone.
And he got the TV remote and just dialed 999 on the remote. And I knew that wasn't right, like, but I also knew if I did it, that could happen to me. So he just said, go to sleep, she'll be up in the morning, it's fine, she's just sleeping. Then I woke up in the morning and he was in the living room. At first I thought he was asleep. And then neither of them were moving or anything. I was scared that if I called an ambulance and he woke up, I'd get told off. So I was pacing for ages, and then I finally called.
On the 8th of February 2013, at about 9:50 in the morning, they received a 999 call from a young girl saying that her daddy is believed dead and bleeding from the mouth. And also, mother is dead as well.
Then they came, and the police were telling me to like leave. We'll put you in the car, and I didn't want to leave. I was like, no, like I wanted to save my mum.
They discovered that John was in the front room with a sheet over him and was clearly deceased and did have blood coming out of his mouth. And then when they were led upstairs by Chloe, they found Suzanne, who was in her bedroom, just against the bed.
I'd just come in from golf, and I'd literally would just walk through the door, and two police officers came into the house, and they said, are you Suzanne's father? And I said, yes. And he said, I'm sorry, but I've got some bad news.
The police accompany him to his wife's workplace.
I walked into the foyer, and she looked at me, and she said, Suzanne. I said, yes. And she said, she's dead. And I said, yes, both of them. and she thought I meant Chloe. But I said no, it was John.
The police officer who was leading the investigation had come with one of the liaison officers to explain, what he thought had happened.
They determined that this was an unexplained death, potentially suspicious, and actually declared it as a murder scene at that time.
He said that he had killed my sister in a headlock like this, and he stood up and showed us how it had happened.
Both bodies undergo post-mortems, and the results are totally unexpected.
They established that both John and Suzanne had a fatal dose of PMA in them, which is a very high strain of ecstasy. It's actually known as Dr. Death or Killer as a street name.
This changes everything. And for Les, more devastating news.
The DCI came round to see us and said that it was no longer a murder-suicide. He said it was self-inflicted, and they treated it as a sex game gone wrong.
We knew Suzanne would never, ever take drugs. That is not, the person that Suzanne was. And we said this to the police, and the liaison officer said to us, well, you didn't know your sister at the end.
It's accepted that she died as a result of this fatal ingestion of PMA. But the question is, how did that get there?
Was there any drinks? Could it have been tested? But they just dismissed everything.
Suzanne actually had bruising around her neck. And again, that should have raised suspicion very early on as to how she had met her death.
They come back and said it was just a sex game that had gone wrong, and that was it.
The only potential witness to events is discounted.
Chloe was never spoken to. She was able to make that phone call to the emergency services, so she would have been eligible for a specialist interview by trained officers and a social worker to elicit as much information as they possibly can out of her.
It was absolutely disgraceful. They didn't know Suzanne.
To have your daughter portrayed as a druggie, in effect, and the excuse for the bruising around her neck was a sex game that had gone wrong, that's just unforgivable.
The media are quick to report the story.
It caused such a lot of damage to Suzanne's reputation. There was a lot of really unkind, very nasty things wrote about Suzanne.
Increasingly, I've started to hear a defence by the perpetrator. It was simply a sex game that has gone wrong, to excuse or to explain the death of their partner. And that excuse, that explanation, almost implies that what happened was consensual. This was something that they were sharing online. It had been some fantasy that they were trying to bring in to their reality. But increasingly, it's become clear to me that that kind of online behavior has seeped, has merged seamlessly into offline reality, that fantasy has become reality. And the idea that it is consensual is one that we've got to resist, because if we give in to the idea that these are merely sex games gone wrong, we are almost giving a charter to abusers to continue to kill their partners. As the family is given permission to collect belongings from the flat, they are shocked at what they find.
My sister had been killed in that flat, but that evidence was just left there. The police had clearly not investigated or even looked for any evidence in that flat.
It was a mess. It was quite eerie as well. It didn't feel like a home anymore.
There was no clothes in the house. There was a suitcase in the hallway. They found receipts of where Suzanne had filled the car up with petrol. Passport was on the ground outside.
Suzanne had a handbag on the floor and we found a handwritten letter that Suzanne had written to him.
The letter that she left, you know, apologising about trivial things, you know, yeah, it's really upsetting to think and wonder what happened in that house.
The letter is incredibly moving and very sad. She's describing violence. She said, "You kicked me in the leg, hit me in the face, and chucked me out in the street at 1 o'clock in the morning in the cold, and you didn't allow me home." This gives us this insight into what domestic abuse is like in reality, to the extent that Suzanne almost seems to be apologizing for the fact that she's going to break up with him. That's the trigger for Wharton, because when a woman wants to leave the relationship is when she is most in danger. That's when he wants to express the ultimate form of power over the woman he's been in a relationship with, a godlike form of power, when he'll take their lives, when he'll decide you will live, or in this case, you will die.
I didn't realise the severity of it all. I didn't think about domestic violence. I never even dreamt that she wouldn't be here with us now.
For the family, the circumstances surrounding Suzanne's death are clear.
Suzanne was leaving him, and this is the most vulnerable time that any woman could be in, that she was actually leaving.
The Van Hagen family want justice for their daughter, but they face a battle to prove Suzanne was killed by John Wharton. The case is closed, but her father Les will not give up.
Our goal was to prove that Suzanne was not a drug addict, that she was a victim of domestic violence and coercion.
We knew it wasn't the truth, and it wouldn't be fair on Suzanne.
It just seemed to consume me. You know, I was always on my computer writing things down and sending off emails.
I've just seen what a toll it's taken on the family, and especially Les.
I had a heart attack, but that didn't deter me. You know, we knew we were in the right and we carried on.
Les and Anne apply to the family court for guardianship of their granddaughter. What they're about to learn will change everything.
The judge asked for reports on Chloe. Those reports came, and that was the first time that we'd found out the real truth of what John was about. We were devastated to know that the police knew what was going on.
There was a marker on my sister's house for domestic violence, and that no officer could attend that house on their own because of him being a cage fighter and because of how dangerous he was.
And the National Health, NHS, knew what was going on.
He was let out of a psych ward earlier than he should have been.
Social services knew what was going on. Found that social services on 2-3 occasions were going to take Chloe into care and decided to give him another chance. Everybody, the police, social services, psychiatric, all seemed to be wanting to give John a second chance.
In 2016, an inquest into Suzanne's death records an open verdict. For the family, it's another blow, and they turn to a colleague of mine, Professor Jane Monckton-Smith, an expert in domestic violence.
I was asked by the family to make some comments on Suzanne's death, and put a fresh pair of eyes on the circumstances.
She focuses on the neighbour's account of Wharton grabbing Suzanne by the throat.
Somebody who uses non-fatal strangulation, the prediction that they might kill you goes up by 7-8 times. It's highly, highly predictive.
Professor Monckton Smith conducts a thorough review of the facts known to the police.
They absolutely knew that John Wharton had this violent history. They knew he had a violent history with partners. They knew that he had serious mental health issues, and they knew that he was a drug taker.
But at the coroner's court, they didn't know half of what went on.
There was a child in the room who actually saw what happened.
It should have been and would have been a different outcome.
What happened is that John Wharton realised that the relationship was ending. The coercive control that he had previously exercised was no longer going to be available to him, and so he was going to seek revenge. Immediately after the attack, Chloe, a key witness, doesn't speak about that night.
And said, you know, do you remember what happened that night? And she said that she did, and she remembered John putting Mum into her arm, like, and putting something down her throat. But that was never became admissible. Apparently, children tell lies.
The Criminal Injuries Compensation Board conduct a review to see if Chloe is eligible for compensation.
The Criminal Injuries Board found in our favour and actually put in writing that Suzanne had been killed due to an act of violence perpetrated by a partner. And that was our first one, where we were just up to, I mean, the elation that we had. But finally, we managed to get a reinvestigation done. It took us 3-4 years of lobbying, letter writing, kicks in the teeth. So Suzanne died in February 13, and it was August of 16 that we managed to get this investigation.
In 2017, West Midlands Police commissioned the Logden Report as an investigation into the force's failings surrounding Suzanne's death.
The liaison officer said to me, Laura, your sister had 2 legs and she should have used them. Like it was her fault that she was in a domestic violence relationship. These women can't just leave. You know, the control that these men have on them is unbelievable.
And it can happen to anybody. I don't think people realise, you know, that it's not just a certain people that it happens to, because it's not.
2 years later, the police post a video on social media.
On behalf of West Midlands Police, I wish to apologise for a number of failings by the force in the handling of Suzanne's case, both before and after her death, and to acknowledge the immense additional distress this has caused to Suzanne's family.
We had the apology that we were right and they were wrong.
We deeply regret a number of missed opportunities to investigate Suzanne's circumstances more widely and to engage with her. And we could and should have done more to protect Suzanne and her daughter.
Oh, the relief. Everything just drained from us.
I can only hope that these words provide some reassurance to Suzanne's family the force has reflected on and learnt from its serious shortcomings.
It's something that you can look back and think, you know, why did she not share that with us? Why did she not come to us for help?
It's something that we as a family did not know anything at all about, but we found out the hard way, and this is something that we needed to pass on to other people.
He was a very manipulative individual and probably would have known exactly the things to say to make Suzanne feel like he was the one.
Suzanne wanted someone to love her. And her vulnerability of just wanting that love cost her life, really.
10 years on from her death, Suzanne's family are left with their memories.
We remember Suzanne every day. She was just a lovely girl, and we all really do miss her. We have got justice for Suzanne, but the only thing I wanted, for me personally, I wanted her death certificate to represent that. And I think until that has been the truth on her death certificate, I don't think, I could rest.